Time for another edition of the Vandy Program. Time to bring back a repeat guest. John Ziegler will join us from California. And we're going to talk about sports mostly and maybe a little California politics since he is there and understands the landscape. John, good morning.
Good morning to you, Dave.
And how are things in California on this? We're taping this on a Tuesday. This is August 11th. So how are things out there?
It's been pretty hot here. We had great weather for the first part of the summer, but it's been hot and rather steamy for our standards here in Southern California.
Yeah, I wish I could sort of compete. I think everybody's complaining about it being hotter than normal, or maybe it's just the fact that I spend a good chunk of my TV watching time on Sky News, where they're fretting about the fact that it is a tropical heat wave, and then I have to do the translation that it's like upper 90s or something,
right?
And that is really hot for them. But enough about the weather. I think the biggest thing that seems to be dominating. Well, let me put this in perspective. I get some of my sports news from The Athletic, and you do understand that there's going to be a bit of a bias there. You smile. But that was their lead story, and even they are kind of tired of all of the noise, and they want to. I'm paraphrasing what was in there, but the writer who was talking about everything that's happening in the WNBA of late was kind of alluding to the fact that they want us to shut up and dribble, or they want the players to shut up and dribble, which is borderline impossible given everything that's gone on. So let me get your take on the hard foul, the white privilege comment, the Sophie Cunningham is meme-worthy and becoming a face of the league, at least recognizable. But does this league run the risk of killing the golden goose?
Well, I don't know if there is a golden goose. I mean, they've never really made any money, but
they're starting to.
But the script.
I mean, they're starting to get ratings, and they're starting to be able to point to, we've got people watching us,
sure.
And a lot of that is because of Caitlin Clark.
And a lot of that's because of this drama, and the script writers have been working overtime on this. I mean, you really, literally could not have made this up. There's so many stories in the news cycle recently that if you had asked me to make up, I could not possibly have done. The Dr. Fauci diary and texts, the Jason Arday Cambridge University scandal, and what's been going on in the WNBA. You just cannot make this up. I mean, just the one incident that you referenced, which is one of many, it seems like on at least a weekly, if not bi-weekly basis, something absolutely crazy happens. But to have one of the most prominent faces in your league, Sophie Cunningham, certainly the most controversial face in your league, almost have her head taken off by and Sophie obviously happens to be white, taken off by a woman who's black, who then gets properly ejected, and then in the locker room immediately posts on social media white privilege in capital letters while tagging the Indiana Fever, which is an important part of this story because eventually, after all the backlash, she will, in a ludicrous attempt to back away from this, is claiming that that's not what she meant, although there's no explanation for what the hell she possibly meant. She clearly, obviously, is lying because she thought that somehow there would be people that would rise to her defense, that she was kicked out of this game as part of some sort of white privilege, when it was one of the most obvious flagrant 2 fouls in the history of the league. And what makes it even worse is that Sophie Cunningham is clearly somebody who very likely was targeted because of who she is and her political beliefs, specifically surrounding transgender basketball players or in sports in general, and trying to protect the traditional definitions of sports, as well as women in locker rooms and women in competition, which is to me, it's only a common sense position that seems to be held by the vast majority of Americans. And yet it's not held by the vast majority of those that control the WNBA. So The WNBA really is not a sports organization. It's an activist organization. It is run by a combination of black women and lesbians, some of whom are black lesbians. And here's the one part of this that might be obvious to people, but I don't think people are saying. But to me, what's really at the heart of this is that Caitlin Clark and Sophie Cunningham have become the two most popular players in the league. They are both white. They are both heterosexual. Caitlin Clark is at least somewhat attractive. Sophie Cunningham is super attractive. That combination, plus the fact that Sophie Cunningham is MAGA adjacent and Caitlin Clark seems to be somewhere trying to avoid politics at all costs, those combinations drive black lesbians crazy. It drives them crazy that those two people have taken over their league because they're everything that they are not. And the jealousy that is driving this and the animosity that is driving this is overwhelming. And that's why I think it's not a stretch at all to presume the worst when it came to that foul. That foul was almost certainly, especially given the post on social media afterwards, almost certainly part of a political targeting. That was almost literally a political assassination on Sophie Cunningham. And so the outrage that it has provoked, I think, is 100% warranted. And it's just amazing what has happened. Now, I actually think that in the short run, all of this is very good for the WNBA because people are talking about the WNBA in ways that they never would. I mean, if the WNBA embraced Caitlin Clark as a really great three-point shooter and one of their best players and someone who's super popular, and they weren't jealous over the fact that a lot of her popularity is based on the fact that she happens to be white and straight and at least somewhat attractive and likable, if all that happened the way that it should, I don't think there would be nearly as much attention on the WNBA by people outside of their core fan base. So at least in the short run, they're, I think, benefiting from this. Now, of course, the other part of this equation is we now have at least two former NBA players that are trying to declare for the WNBA draft, which I think is both genius and inevitable. I'm amazed this hasn't happened prior because that's always been the most confusing part to me, Dave, about the WNBA or women's basketball in general, embracing transgender men, I guess you call them, playing in their sport. Because there is no sport that is more vulnerable to being destroyed by one biological male becoming a member of a women's team than basketball. And this is why those two former WNBAers who are obviously doing this for publicity and hopefully, I think, to make a principled point, and it'll be interesting to see where it goes, but they also happen to fit into the demographic of exactly what I've always said. Give me one 6'8" or taller, and in this, I think one of them is, 6'10". We give them one 6'8" or taller, highly proficient male basketball player, put him in the WNBA, and that player's team will win every game by at least 50 points. At least they will be unbeatable, and it will destroy the entire league. So why is it that the players are taking a political position, which, if you follow it out to its ultimate logical conclusion, would literally end their league? It's baffling, and I do think that it really goes to the disease of the progressive mindset. And I joked on social media the other day, although it wasn't really much of a joke. If you took away the Democratic Socialists of America and the WNBA, Democrats would be ready to win a massive victory in the midterm elections. But I really think the WNBA and the DSA are keeping Republicans in the game because I think, and obviously it's not a conscious decision to relate the WNBA to the midterm elections, but I do think it goes to what happens when progressives are in charge. and it's complete and total dysfunction and insanity. And that's what the WNBA has become.
And I think Ennis Cantor Freedom and Royce White are the two former NBA players. Ennis Freedom had a much more storied career than Royce White did. Royce White played professionally, I believe, in Europe and then in Canada. And Royce White is a more admitted political character. But one of the interesting things I saw about this, and I believe it was in the Athletics article, was they said that they were knowingly making a mockery of the WNBA's gender policies, which you can make a couple arguments there. First of all, was it possible, I don't want to bring Leah Thomas into this, but let's bring Leah Thomas into this. Was it possible that Leah Thomas, who male to female transition, probably not complete, identified as a female and then won a bunch of races in swimming, that in and of itself kind of made a mockery of the whole thing. So all that Freedom and White are really doing is kind of pointing over here and saying, you did this already in swimming, so let's get some solid definitions down.
Well, let's be clear. I mean, what these two former professional basketball players are doing is to make a mockery. They are trying to make a point. They are getting publicity. I would doubt very seriously that either of them is ever going to play in a WNBA game. But it doesn't mean that it's not an important point, because they are illustrating absurdity with absurdity. And they are forcing, which they've already done, because apparently the WNBA is going to have a hilarious meeting to try to determine what the heck the definition of a woman is. I mean, my gosh, I would love to be a fly on the wall there. But this is this wouldn't be an issue if the WNBA and women's sports organizations in general could just simply make a very clear-cut rule that if you are not born as a biological woman, you cannot play in our league, period. We're the Women's National Basketball Association. This shouldn't be difficult. This is very easy. But politically, that's not a tenable position, because the league has been taken over by a super progressive element of athlete that either believes in or doesn't want to say publicly that they don't believe in this cockamamie idea that you can believe that you are a woman, even though you were biologically born as a male and have all the male parts, and still be treated as a woman. That is not the definition of a woman. That is the definition of mental illness. All right? That is the core problem. That is a literal mental illness that you have, that you believe that somehow you're a woman even though you are a biological male. And so that's the core problem. And that's not what's happening now is just the illustration of that problem in a way that I think could be potentially productive. I mean, I don't know what the WNBA is going to do here. My guess is they'll come up with some standards for transitioning to being a woman that would, to make sure that these guys are not eligible. That's probably what they'll do. But they want to keep open this idea that somehow someone could be a biological male and still be considered a woman. It'll be interesting to see how they thread that needle.
Probably, my gut tells me what they'll probably do is say, if you have never played basketball professionally,
that could do that.
At the collegiate level as a male, then you are eligible.
That's possible. But then the first thing that should happen is that a 6'8" white guy who can't make it to the next level because he's playing center and he's not tall enough to play center in college and played in high school, he should do the same thing, because he would be almost as effective at proving the point as a former NBA or professional basketball player would. You don't have to be that good. A really good 6'8" high school basketball player would dominate the WNBA.
Yeah, and I think there's part of this that is just, your word absurd is a good one, because everyone who's anywhere near college basketball, women's college basketball specifically, knows about the scout teams. They know
Right.
that is something that goes on everywhere. And it's a badge of honor for, say, the UConn guys who, again, are probably not good enough to play at a collegiate level. Maybe they could have played D3. But the idea is that these are guys who are good enough to play against these women to prepare them for playing against other women. And I think it's something that it's funny. They being the mostly left-leaning media seem to ignore that takes place at college levels. It's like it's not part of it's not part of something that we really talk about, but it's a reality that if the women's teams, especially the really good ones, get really good by practicing against the guys who are just, a little bit up here. And then I think that shows kind of the difference between biological difference between men and women. And it's something that I don't know if the WNBA is really ready to address that without just coming out with a definition that would satisfy the "what is a woman" crowd.
Yeah,
but
I think they're probably going to do what you did. I think they're going to punt, create a temporary rule to eliminate these guys, and then eventually they're going to have to revisit this because I think someone will, whatever rule they come up with, I think there's going to be enough of an incentive structure for somebody to take advantage of it or try to do the same thing that these guys are doing. At least that's the most logical thing that's going to happen. I'll tell you what's not going to happen. I don't think they're not going to say, come on in. Anyone who says there's a woman, they're a woman is eligible to play, and we're gonna draft you. That's not going to happen. And they're also not going to say that a woman is clearly defined as somebody who was born biologically as a woman. That's not going to happen. Those two options are off the table. So it's going to be something else.
Yeah, they'll have a totally different needle to try to thread. Needle to thread? Yeah. You thread the needle. You don't
Correct.
needle the thread. So, yeah, of course. Sticking with sports for a little bit, you're a college football guy.
Used to be. College football no longer exists. So it used to be my favorite sport. I've been a huge fan of college football since I was very, very young, but I am having a very, very difficult time finding anything to be of interest anymore. The sport has lost me almost completely.
So what killed it for you?
Well, I've never seen any institution kill itself more clearly, dramatically, and quickly than college football has since COVID. I mean, and I do think the COVID panic plays a subconscious role in this. The whole idea of a great reset and, this idea that everything we thought we knew prior to COVID is no longer really valid and doesn't really mean anything. It provided an enormous amount of opportunity for people that wanted to change things. And so I do think that there is a real, somewhat symbiotic relationship between the COVID panic and what happened with college football. But it was a combination of factors, all of which transpired at basically the same time period, which was radical conference realignment, expansion of the football playoff, the making legal with no real restrictions of NIL and instant transfers. And all four of those things, which I've been very open to being ahead of the curve. Sometimes I'm right, sometimes I'm wrong, but being outspoken about something against the grain and against public opinion, I was as out in front and as outspoken as anybody I'm aware of about what was going to happen, specifically with regard to unlimited NIL and instant transfers. And then when you combine that with radical realignment and an expanded playoff, how that was going to destroy everything that was good about the sport. If you had asked me, this is kind of like how we started with, if I had been asked to parody some of the stories in the news. If you had asked me, okay, is it possible to destroy college football in just a few short years? I really don't think I could have possibly come up with a scenario that is done so more completely and more quickly than what has transpired. If you had given an evil entity whose goal it was to destroy college football unlimited resources 6 years ago and said, go at it, I honestly don't think they could have been this successful, because literally everything that I found interesting and compelling about the sport is gone, especially when you consider the other element of this is that football itself in that same period has almost disappeared. I mean, it's one of the most amazing and underreported stories of my lifetime that the most popular sport in America has essentially castrated itself over the last less than a decade, and nobody in charge has even admitted to this. It's not the same sport. It's not close to the same sport. And there are a lot of reasons for that, some of which are legitimate, most of which I think are exaggerated. But, I mean, look at the size of the shoulder pads. And in the college game, they're wearing shorts now. They're wearing shorts. Now, the only reason why they're not wearing shorts in the NFL is the NFL has a very strict uniform regulation where the pants have to come down to the knee. But in the college game, for some reason, they don't have that. They're wearing shorts. They look like they're going to the beach. It's absurd because it's not a physical sport anymore. Nowhere near what it used to be. And there are some people, when I say that, think, oh, is this bloodlust, or do you love the injuries? No, that's not even close to what it is. I'm not in favor of concussions. I absolutely believe that concussions are a real issue, but we have gone so far overboard. And this is consistent with our society as a whole, with the whole safety over everything belief that we are so risk adverse, and that we take any decisions of risk out of the hands of the people that are actually making them. This is a lot like COVID, by the way. I mean, I knew that the COVID panic was going to destroy tackle football. And people, what? What's the connection there? In the COVID panic, we lost control over our own medical decisions, our own decisions of risk, all right? We lost that. It was taken out of our hands. If as a society, you do not have control over your own medical risk decision, you cannot have tackle football. It is not possible, especially for people that are not yet fully adults, like high school and early college. So, because liberals, especially when they control academia, are going to make that decision for them. We're going to take those decisions of medical risk out of your hands, and we are going to make everything safe for you. Well, like so much in life, the pendulum has swung too far. At one point, I would agree that probably in the 1970s, tackle football was too dangerous. By the way, in the turn of the 1800s into the 1900s, it was so dangerous that the game almost got outlawed until Teddy Roosevelt stepped in and changed the rules a bit, because people were literally dying. Nobody dies in football anymore. Even when we think they've died, they don't actually die, like Damar Hamlin in the Buffalo Bills situation a couple of years ago. Thankfully, he survived, although I think his story has not been properly told. But that's a separate issue. But the point here is that I think the sport is way too safe. And everything that was great about college football, the traditions, the rivalries, the conferences, every game mattering, the knowing that you're going to have a player that's going to stay with you for 4 or 5 years because transfers were extremely difficult, having some sort of loyalty to your team. To me, the biggest problem that almost no one ever talks about with regard to NIL is that when you create an incentive structure where the primary reason why a player will play for your team or go to your school, at least temporarily, because they might transfer immediately if they don't like it, when that incentive structure is based entirely in how much money they are going to get paid, it destroys the foundation of why we cared in the first place. Because, let me give you an example. I don't know how big of a sports fan you are, but the greatest college football rivalry, at least in modern times, has always been considered to be Ohio State, Michigan. And having having covered that rivalry, I agree with that. And a huge part of why that game has always mattered is that if you lived in Ohio or Michigan, then and you played football, there was an understanding that at the very least you were going to consider going to Ohio State or Michigan because you were representing your state. That mattered. And what it meant to be a Michigan man mattered. And what it meant to be an Ohio State man or family mattered. You grew up in an Ohio State family or a Michigan family. You had friends, relatives, maybe parents that went to that school. And so occasionally there would be a guy from Michigan that would go to Ohio State or vice versa. And that was actually kind of cool because it showed the intensity of the rivalry where they're trying to cherry pick each other. But these are two border states that care greatly about the sport of football. And every year they're playing one game to determine not just which team was better that year. They're determining what team was better over the last generation because it was a generation of data points that caused those players to determine whether or not they're going to Michigan or Ohio State. You had guys well after Bo Schembechler retired going to Michigan because of Bo Schembechler. The same with Woody Hayes and Ohio State. All those things mattered. And now, none of it matters. Nothing matters because it can all be erased and is erased by a check. It's all just who the highest bidder is, which means, by the way, that over time, the people playing at Ohio State are not going to be coming from Ohio. The people playing for Michigan are not going to be from Michigan. They're going to be from all over the country. They're not going to give a fuck about Ohio State, Michigan. They're not going to understand Ohio State, Michigan. They're going to have no understanding, no care. And by the way, if they don't like it, they can leave in a year. So you've just destroyed the greatest thing that was ever created in the sport. I'm a big believer, Dave, that when you get magic in life, it is incredibly rare, unbelievably rare, that you can find or create or get lucky enough to have magic. And when you get that magic, it must be protected at all costs because when it's gone forever. It's gone forever. Look what's happened with, this is just the first example of many off my mind. Disney, right? I got two young daughters. Disney used to be magic. But over time, they got lax, they went woke, they let the magic be destroyed. And now the magic of Disney is gone. And it's never coming back. It's never coming back. They can pretend that it still exists, but it doesn't. And then Disney uses the word magic, literally the Magic Kingdom and all that. It's the same thing with Ohio State, Michigan. It's the same thing with Notre Dame, USC. How the fuck are Notre Dame and USC not playing football for 4 fucking years on the 100th anniversary of the rivalry? How the fuck is that even possible? I'm going far afield here, but you asked me a question that I obviously feel a great deal of passion about, and it's just the stupidest and saddest thing that I've ever seen happen to sports, and none of it was necessary. None of it was necessary. That's the part that's really frustrating.
Yeah, you remember back, and this probably goes back 20 years or so, when Ohio State played Michigan, and they were 1-2. And then there was a real chance that, I think Ohio State won that game, but there was a real chance that Michigan could have been, this is in the BCS era, Michigan could have been the number 2 team and they could have played again for the national championship. That would have been an aberration. But what's happened lately with respect to that rivalry, the Big Ten's expansion, et cetera, it doesn't matter. The winner, I mean, we had when Michigan won the national, was it the year that Michigan won the national championship? Ohio State beat them in the big game.
This is one of my pet peeves, and I'm gonna try to restrain myself here.
Have at it.
Okay, so for the last 2 straight years, if you're a young Ohio State, Michigan fan, okay, if you're a fan of either of those teams, you have been taught over the last 2 years that not only is the Ohio State Michigan game not that important, it's actually a problem. Because 2 years ago, Ohio State lost to Michigan on their home field in a massive upset. Should have destroyed their season by every standard that's ever been created in the history of the sport. It should have been devastating for Ohio State. They went on to the playoffs and won the national championship. So in the minds of Ohio State, especially young Ohio State fans, there's an inverse correlation between beating Michigan and having a successful season. Then the next year, Ohio State goes to Michigan's stadium and ends the Michigan winning streak, which should have been a season maker for Ohio State in every year that's ever been created in the history of the sport prior to this one. But this time, Ohio State goes to the playoffs and loses. And so they look at their season as a failure. By the way, they lost the Big Ten championship game. So in Ohio State's mind, there's an inverse correlation between beating Michigan and having a successful season. You could argue that if Ohio State hadn't put so much energy into beating Michigan at the end of the regular season, maybe they win the Big Ten championship game the next week, and maybe they do better in the playoffs. And so with an expanded playoff, we're going to see it be routine that either one or maybe even both of those teams effectively take a dive. Because if you're a good Ohio State or Michigan team, you're already a lock for the playoffs. And who knows if they're going to keep the conference championship games. This is another one of my pet peeves. How in the world they're going to get rid of the conference championship games in order to expand the playoffs is maybe the dumbest, if it's certainly one of the top 5 dumbest things I can even think of. Because if you don't have a conference championship game, this is where people are so stupid. They just don't think things through. In the olden days, you didn't need a conference championship game because you only had 10 teams in the Big Ten, which meant that you played everyone or almost everyone in a particular season, which meant that the regular season title meant something because you played everybody. But now, because of radical realignment, that's no longer valid. You've got conferences with 18 teams. You literally only play half the teams in your conference. If you only play half the teams in your conference, the regular season title is completely meaningless. That's why you need a conference championship game. If you don't have a conference championship game, you don't have a conference title. And if you don't have a conference title, you don't have a conference. And if you don't have a conference, anyone that knows anything about the history of college football, if you don't have a conference, you don't have a fucking sport, because it is the conferences that have been the bedrock of all this. The SEC being the most prominent example, the Big Ten I put as the second best example because the Big Ten now has USC and UCLA and Oregon, which is just a freaking abomination from a geographical perspective. But the SEC at least still has the core of what has always been the SEC. It's still essentially geographically grounded. Although, we've got Oklahoma and Texas, but Missouri, okay, fine. But at least there's some semblance of geographical connectivity there. And
I think they border each other.
Yeah, they border. So there's a whole bunch of border states. By the way, I this is off far afield, but I really think that the modern configuration of the SEC is essentially going to be its own country in the not too distant future as America splits up. But and I mean that sincerely. But the reason why SEC foments so much passion is because of the conference and the border wars and the intra state battles, like in Alabama, between Alabama and Auburn. That's what drives this. Is the only it's a regional sport. The beauty of what used to be before the BCS, the old bowl system. The beauty of the sport was that it used to be a regional endeavor where at the end of the year, the best teams from all those regions got together during the holidays and played in these festivals called the Rose Bowl or the Sugar Bowl or the Orange Bowl in these exotic places in warm weather during New Year's, and determined for that year, okay, which teams were the best, which region had the best team. But before that, all anyone really cared about, other than maybe Ohio State Notre Dame, which was why USC Notre Dame, which is why USC Notre Dame was so great, because it was the one intersectional rivalry that people cared about. But that was unusual. That was unusual at the time because teams, partially because of travel, played teams that were in their basic geographical location within their region. And that fomented rivalries, and people cared about that. But now that's all gone. And I have been, awaiting, and I don't know if I've been hoping, but I've been kind of disappointed that this hasn't happened, to see that there are going to be a large number of fans that have my same reaction to all this, and that so far has not happened. I do not understand. I've been surprised that the interest, at least via the ratings and attendance levels at college football games, has not been impacted by this. Yet, I still believe that maybe people like me, who do exist, although we're obviously a very small minority, are just ahead of the curve and have thought this thing through sooner than most people. I mean, because this has always been a religion. And I say all the time on my podcast, The Death of Journalism, you can't treat a religion like only a business and expect people to keep referring to and treating it like a religion. Those two things are adverse to each other. And now that college football has become literally just a business, I think eventually, I don't know how long it's going to take, there are going to be core fans that are going to go, wait a minute, why am I still treating this like a religion? It's just a business. And the religion aspect of this was always the magic, and that magic to me is long.
I think Indiana might have stopped that bleeding for a little bit because the magic came back, and that was a story a lot of people randos.
And look, to me, Indiana is the exception that proves the rule, because look, I love the Indiana story on paper, right? I mean, that's a great story. Longtime doormat comes out of nowhere in a couple of years with a new coach and an exciting quarterback. Mendoza wins the Heisman Trophy, and then they go on undefeated. I was surprised that they were able to do it, but there's a couple of things. First of all, they did it with a very old roster, so they were kind of gaming the system a bit. They had a ton of transfers, so these are not kids that went to Indiana because they wanted to go to Indiana, all right? These are kids that went there because the coach, which is fine, and because of NIL money. And because the coach, I think, figured out the system faster than anybody else did, that, oh my gosh, we can have a roster of 24-year-olds and we can be very effective here. But here's the part that drives me crazy about the Indiana story. So Mendoza, right? You got to love him, right? Extraordinary story. There's a lot to like there. Except 13 months before he won Indiana the national championship, he led Cal to a victory over Stanford because he was at University of California. And after the game, he gave this stirring speech with 10 out of 10 passion, where he talked about his brothers from Cal, and they'll be forever bonded. And he said, I believe he ended it by saying, Golden Bears forever. And 13 months later, he was leading Indiana to a national championship because he betrayed his team, California, his Golden Bears forever, because they didn't have enough NIL money. So he goes to Indiana and wins a national championship. What happened to Golden Bears forever?
It was a golden parachute over to Bloomington.
But this is the best story college football can possibly imagine, and it's absolutely corrupted. It's absolutely corrupted. And so to me, that's the ultimate, exception that proves the rule.
You touched on I guess, something about maybe a Civil War-ish type thing with the SEC part of the country geographically splitting up from the rest of us. So let's go there. What are your thoughts about politics writ large and where everything is trending with the socialists on one side and the extreme MAGA part of the universe on the other side, and a lot of people in the middle kind of looking around wondering where this is all going? Where's it all going?
Well, just to clarify my previous comments, I think we're already living in 3 different countries, at least. I believe that there's the Northeast and maybe parts of the upper Midwest. So kind of like what used to be the Big Ten. So I think that's one country. There's the SEC combined with the upper Midwest. And so that's another country. So like the Southeast to the heart, through the heart of the country, that's another country. And then you have the West Coast. Those are 3 different countries that live in 3 different basic realities, 3 different belief systems. And it's getting worse on a daily basis. We live in information bubbles. We live in almost completely different realities. And eventually that is going to come home to roost, because the foundations, we just celebrated, I think rather meekly, our 250th birthday as a country. And I think we saw a lot of cracks in the foundation during that celebration. I mean, a lot of people saw the 250th through the prism of whether or not you approve of Donald Trump or not. I mean, if you're a Trump American or you're a non-Trump American, and I think that's incredibly damaging, and it does not bode well for the future of the country, because there's going to be issues and challenges, and they might be huge, especially if AI turns out to be what a lot of people are claiming it will be, that are going to, they're going to test the foundation. And that foundation of this country is extremely weak. It's cracked. It's divided. And I do think that it's broken up largely on geographic grounds. And I think it's pretty clear that those are 3 different countries that we live in right now. And I don't know exactly when or how it's all going to break apart, but I won't be here to see it, but I will be stunned if at the 300th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, the United States is still 50 states configured the way that it currently is.
What can be done, if anything, to stop this from happening?
I don't know. I mean, I politically, I think we're in a vicious cycle, because now, look, I'm the last conservative standing that doesn't like and has never supported Donald Trump, even though I think there are some good things about him, and I'm glad that Kamala Harris was never president. But I've never publicly been a supporter of Donald Trump. But I don't want to blame everything on Donald Trump. I think Donald Trump saw our divisions and he took advantage of them. He also exacerbated them. But he's also now created this cycle where every time, someone is in charge, it's about destroying what the last guy did. And, if Republicans lose in 2028, which I think is a very high likelihood, depending on who Democrats nominate for president, whoever that Democrat president is going to spend the first year just erasing everything, literally, that Donald Trump ever did. And it's going to be this never-ending cycle of revenge and retribution, further dividing us. And the reason why I'm pessimistic is that the way that the political incentive structure is currently set up, there's no chance for a quote-unquote moderate healer to ever be the nominee of a major party. It's not possible. It's not even theoretically possible. So we're just going to keep getting people at one extreme or the other, at least with regard to the perception of their politics. And it's all going to be about dunking on the other side. That's all it is. It's just who gets to dunk on the other side for the next 2 years or 4 years. And that's not healthy, and I don't see a way out of it. I mean, maybe there is one, but I haven't come up with one, at least not one that's realistic.
On the Democratic side, for the 2028 nomination, I just checked, I think it was Kalshi this morning, and number one was Gavin Newsom, and then next was AOC. And I think we kind of want to get your thoughts on this. Is Gavin, are either of these possibly going to make it out of the primary? Because I don't see, I'm not sure that either of them could survive the primary the way the primary is set up.
Why do you believe that?
Well, I mean, you're the guest, so let me get your thoughts on that. I just think that starting in South Carolina sort of sets it up perhaps for Kamala round two.
Well, I don't know that the calendar has been 100% set yet, but yeah, there's a good, I mean, for all intents and purposes, South Carolina has now become the new, what used to be Iowa and New Hampshire. Iowa no longer counts for Democrats because there's too many rural white people. They're irrelevant. I'm being serious.
Yes.
They're going to claim it's because Iowa had trouble counting votes one time, but it's really because of all the rural white people. And so South Carolina clearly is very key, and the black vote in South Carolina is huge. Here's my view. I think there's really only, at most, 5 people that can win the Democratic nomination. I think you've got Harris, Newsom, AOC, Buttigieg, and maybe John Ossoff from Georgia, although I find it hard to believe he's going to be able to win a Senate campaign in Georgia and then turn around and immediately run for president and win. That seems, there's a lot of Ossoff talk right now, so I put him into the camp of the possible. Is it possible that a 6th person could emerge? Yeah, but we're living in such a fragmented media state. See, I think we're slow to realize how much the system has changed. I mean, people say, well, Barack Obama came out of nowhere. No, Barack Obama really didn't come out of nowhere. Barack Obama was celebrated in 2004 at his convention speech, and he was a rock star within the Democratic Party. And then in 2008, the media, which still had a lot of power then, and I did an entire documentary film about this called Media Malpractice, How Obama Got Elected, which was very prominent and did very, very well. So I'm an expert on this topic. The reality is that the media in 2008 still had a large enough audience and still worked as a monolith enough to where they could carry a Barack Obama on their back and make him the Democratic nominee. And that's what they did. And let's be clear, even under those extraordinary circumstances, which do not exist today, could not exist today, people forget that Hillary Clinton actually got more primary votes than Barack Obama did in the 2008 Democratic primary process. Hillary Clinton if there was somebody that got an election stolen from them in modern times, it was Hillary Clinton in 2008 in the Democratic nominating process. But the media was just so invested in Obama that they were going to let him do whatever the hell he wanted. And the Democratic Party thought it would be racist if they somehow took the nomination away from the black guy. But those circumstances don't exist anymore. The media doesn't have that kind of power, nor is there once you've done the first black president thing, you can't go back to that again. It's been done. Now, I guess you could find a black female, but there is no black female that, other than Harris, I guess, if you call her a black female. And if Harris runs, and I think she probably will, the way I look at this is I think, Dave, that we're now in a world where the only thing that matters is your demographics and your branding / celebrity. That's all that matters. Your policy positions are really maybe part of your branding, but that's it. It's really about which demographics you appeal to and represent, and what your level of celebrity is connected to your branding. And Harris is going to be enticed to run because of her name recognition and because a lot of the national polls indicate that, she's at the top, but those polls are irrelevant because it's purely name recognition, which is why, as you referenced, the betting markets don't have her as the betting favorite. I think that the socialists doing so well in Democratic primaries has essentially forced AOC to run. I was not convinced she was going to run until we saw this socialist takeover of the Democratic Party. And so somebody is going to have to represent that within the Democratic primary, and AOC has by far the best position to do that. So because she's going to run, and because she'll be able to generate a lot of money and interest and traction and media coverage, I think this really harms Harris, because I think she takes obviously being the woman, I think an ethnic woman, I think she takes a huge bite out of Harris. And I think that you could what I don't know is what's the black vote in South Carolina going to do in that decision between AOC and Harris. My guess is, they're going to have a predilection for Harris. They're going to be predisposed to Harris, but I don't know if they're going to vote as a monolithic group. They usually do. But I also think that South Carolina in a real 5 or 6 person race isn't going to be determinative. I think that what we're going to see here under my scenario is that each of those 5 people that I talked about, or depending on whether Ossoff runs, they're going to have a pretty firm hold on a fairly large portion of the Democratic base. I don't see this being a quick knockout for anybody. And so if AOC diminishes Harris and starts to get real traction, I actually think it helps Newsom, as much as I can't stand that, because I loathe Gavin Newsom more than anybody I know. My daughters still refer to him as Governor Poosum from the COVID panic because he was absolutely horrendous. But under my theory of this, I think that you're going to, if I'm right, and let's say Ossoff doesn't run, and if you have those 4 at the top, you're going to have a significant group of moderates going, holy fuck, what are we doing here? We've got AOC, Harris, who's terrible, Buttigieg, who's gay. Who in that group looks, at least in branding, at least on the surface, as a traditional candidate? Well, we've got this straight, white, good-looking male in California who is a progressive. Why don't we rally around this guy? And he will be able to he will appear somewhat moderate in comparison to AOC. So I think that there's a chance that in a panic, the semi-rational people within the Democratic Party go, help, help, help. Let's grab this life raft called Gavin Newsom. And he ends up winning the nomination. Now, maybe that's just my fear of Newsom, because I do think he's an extinction level event as president. But I don't see, and granted, it was a long time, but I'm also a believer that presidential elections are a lot like aircraft carriers. They are very difficult in this day and age to turn around. And once they're out of port, they're going in a particular direction, and that's pretty much set. And so it's hard for me to imagine it, because I've tried. Okay, what are the other scenarios here? I mean, like, for instance, there's a lot of people that still think Governor Shapiro in Pennsylvania might have a shot. Well, Governor Shapiro is Jewish, and clearly Jewish. And there's no chance that a straight white male Jewish person is going to be, he could be the vice presidential nominee. He probably should have been Harris's vice presidential nominee. But I just don't see how he's going to gain traction. Same thing with Andy Beshear in Kentucky. As I said on CNN a couple weeks ago, there is no chance in hell that a straight white male non-celebrity from Kentucky is going to emerge from this Democratic Party as the presidential nominee. It's just not possible. So that's why I think that there's really only, as I said, maybe 5 people that can win the nomination, and I don't like any of them.
What about Mark Kelly?
No, I don't even know that he would run. I don't know what's his base of support within the Democratic Party.
Well, the reason I ask is because I think the prevailing wisdom in 24, when Biden dropped out, was that had it gone to a convention, a contested convention, that Mark Kelly was the guy that Obama and others were going to rally behind.
Right, but that's being selected by the elites. I totally get the Mark Kelly theory. Straight white male astronaut from a purple state that's a swing state, Arizona. It makes a lot of sense. That's not what can work in a multi-candidate Democratic primary that's being dominated by super progressives. He doesn't have the celebrity. I doubt he would have the money. I doubt he would have the media support. I just don't. I mean, could he be a contender if he decided to run? Sure. But I think all he does, because this goes back to my demographics and branding, he might take a bite out of Newsom. He might take a bite out of Shapiro. And, I don't know if there's anything to take a bite out of with Beshear or Pritzker. But there's only so many straight white males that can survive in a Democratic primary. I mean, you can't be a straight white male on the Democrat side anymore. You cannot be. And so there's only a certain number of people within the Democratic primary base that's going to be willing to vote for a straight white male, which is, why if Ossoff doesn't run, and Ossoff is, I think, technically Jewish, although he's not, it's not as overt as it is with Shapiro, but which I think could be a problem for Ossoff. And being, from Georgia, he's going to have to take some positions that would be adverse to the crazy wing of the Democratic Party. But let's say Ossoff doesn't run, then that leaves the straight white male lane wide open for Gavin Newsom. And there's going to be it's not pervasive, but there's enough people that realize, well, wait a minute, maybe we should run a straight white male, because that seems to be, from an electoral perspective, that seems to be advantageous for us. Look what happened with Joe Biden. We got Joe Biden in, and he was terrible, and he was a straight white male. So I just think that right now I see Newsom's path more clearly than I see others. My number one prediction is I think it's going to be a prolonged battle. I don't see how anybody from this field emerges as the clear favorite, winning South Carolina in dominating fashion and winning New Hampshire in dominating fashion, and that's it. Now, I guess that could happen, but I would be surprised. I would be very surprised.
So earlier you touched on COVID a little bit. And mentioned the Fauci diaries, and the Fauci, the latest is the text messages. I can tell you that the most incendiary thing I have said on Facebook maybe ever was putting a picture of Fauci up with the caption, "Evil, evil man." So I want to get your take on, I guess the latest revelation is that Fauci did acknowledge in a private text message that there could be a miscarriage risk if someone pregnant got the COVID vaccine. There is a study that I'm told has been kind of debunked because of numbers that the risk it appears to be about the same with or without the shot, but I think the underlying question here is not only what did he know and when did he know it, but how did he use what he knew to try to get people to get the vaccine. So your take on all things Fauci.
I've hated Fauci from almost the beginning. It was always very clear to me he was an egomaniac and that was a major conflict of interest, because if you're in charge of the pandemic and the pandemic is the greatest thing that's ever happened to you because you're getting more attention than you've ever gotten in your life, what is your incentive to ever end the pandemic or to say that it's over? It doesn't exist. And it also means that if you want to be loved, which Fauci clearly did from his diaries, he wanted desperately to be loved. He loved the fact that he was now a celebrity. You're going to do things that make sure that you maintain your celebrity status. And that means that you are going to change your positions based upon what the liberal elites want. And, masking was the perfect example of this. Fauci completely changed his position on masking from February of 2020 to May of 2020. And the reason why he did that was not because of science. He did that because the liberal elites had adopted masks as an anti-Trump virtue signal. Period. End of sentence. That's what happened with masks. And that had an enormous impact. Now, with regard to this vaccine story, I find this to be beyond outrageous. It's very clear that whatever level of risk there was with regard to pregnant women taking the vaccine and having miscarriages, that Fauci thought it was real. And others within the quote-unquote health establishment thought it was real. And they purposely hid that information. At the same time, they were going out of their way to say that everybody, including pregnant women, should get the vaccine. It doesn't get more outrageous than that. It doesn't. And if Fauci was perceived as a Trump guy, this would be the biggest story in the country for this week, without question. But because Fauci is protected by the legacy media, because he's perceived as an anti-Trump guy, at best it's a one-off. Let's report this, let's mute it, and let's move on. And there's also, I think, a presumption within the left-wing media. And let's be clear, the left-wing media has a massive conflict of interest here. And it's not just political. It's their own self-interest, which is that they were all part of this lie. They can't just condemn Fauci without condemning themselves, because they took a huge part in this whole thing. They tried to destroy people that were contrarian in their positions. They carried Fauci's water 24/7 on these things. They said completely ridiculous things in retrospect about COVID in general and masking and the vaccines. And look, I'm not a vaccine absolutist or an activist or a zealot. I still get in trouble from my wife to this day because I took the vaccine. I believe she did on my advice. Not the mRNA, but we took the Johnson & Johnson because at the time, not because I cared about the COVID part. I just wanted here in California, I wanted to be able to have the card that got me to be able to live a somewhat normal life. But because the data at the start was really tremendous. People forget that, those that are anti-vaccine. The first couple of months that the vaccine became available, cases dropped like a rock. And I bought into the idea, okay, it must be stopping transmission. It must be highly effective. And, what's the big deal? But clearly over time, that data dramatically changed. The vaccine advocates will never explain to you how it is that the highest level of transmission not just in America, but around the world, transpired well after the vaccine was widely available. How is that possible? That's impossible. The vaccine was anywhere near as effective as you claimed. And as far as the vaccine dangers, I've always been very hesitant to jump to conclusions. And I agree that the data is a little bit more ambiguous than some are claiming online as far as the miscarriage, but it's clearly Fauci and Zelensky and others thought it was a serious matter that they didn't tell people about. In fact, they advised in the opposite direction, all because they were so deeply invested in the vaccine working. And here's the one thing I'll say that I've never hear anyone else talk about. Why were they so invested in the vaccine working? There was three basic reasons. One, there's big pharma and this idea, and science can fix anything. So there's that ego part of it. But then there's also the political part of it, where Trump was no longer in office, and the Biden administration really wanted to be able to promote this narrative of, see, Trump screwed this all up. As soon as we got in, we fixed this all, and you can trust us on health and science. We're the party of science. Science works, and aren't we awesome? So they were really invested, especially after those first couple of months where the data was so good that, oh my gosh, this is going to be awesome for us. This is the golden ticket. But then there's the third part of this that I find to be the most interesting. And that is that, having lived in California during this fiasco, I feel like I'm pretty well qualified to make this assessment. I think that there were a lot of liberals who realized deep down that they had overreacted. And they didn't want to admit this publicly, but they wanted to get back to normal life. And the vaccine provided a face-saving mechanism for them. That if we have this magic vaccine that everybody is forced to take, then we can say that, aha, that's the demarcation point where we can go back to normal. We could have gone back to normal like almost immediately, but we didn't, because a whole lot of political and psychological reasons that are fascinating and infuriating. But the bottom line is the vaccine was psychological. It was a face-saving maneuver. It was allowing liberals to go back to normal life without having to admit that they had panicked and overreacted. That's really what the essence of the vaccine was all about, in my opinion.
That actually sounds plausible to me. People hate to admit that they were wrong.
Oh yeah, it's far easier to dupe somebody than to get them to admit that they've been duped, and that's really what I think transpired during COVID.
So, I guess final thoughts. Where can we find your latest work, your podcast, and what's coming down the pike for John?
Well, I do a podcast weekly called The Death of Journalism, which is available widely. It's subscriber based, but I think it's worth it for people that are interested in the topic of the death of journalism and everything that surrounds it. I'm active on Twitter. My Twitter handle is ZigmanFreud. I don't know when you're releasing this, but I'm doing 2 segments on CNN on Alex Michelson's show on Wednesday evening. So if it's past Wednesday evening, you'll probably check out my social media for whatever clips come from that appearance. I'm seemingly doing that on a semi-regular basis now. So that's basically what's going on in my media world.
And I saw your last edition. The name escapes me of the person that you were debating, but it was a really good back and forth.
The woman that I was debating on CNN, she's a lawyer who's very liberal, and we were talking about Dr. Fauci and the diaries, and I don't know who I'm going to be on with this particular week, but it could be her again. I'm not sure.
Awesome. John Ziegler, thanks for hopping on the show, and we appreciate it. We'll see you down the road.
Thanks, Dave.